I was 40 years into the antique trade when a piece finally looked back at me. People always think the creepiest items are dolls, portraits, or old music boxes. They buy them to feel brave, to flirt with danger from the safety of their couch. Let me tell you this as a man of 57 with more dead customers than repeat ones. The most dangerous thing I ever brought into my shop was an old wooden cabinet, barely taller than my chest, with a single cracked glass eye in the middle of its door. I found it at an estate I had no intention of visiting that day. It was raining, heavy and sideways, the kind of rain that makes wipers useless. My phone buzzed while I sat in the car outside my shop, debating whether to close early. It was a lawyer from a rural town an hour away. The last surviving relative of an old family had died, no children, and the house needed to be cleared fast. They heard I paid in cash and asked if I could come the same day. I should have said no. Instead, I grabbed my ledger and keys and drove. The house sat alone at the end of a narrow road, half swallowed by trees. It was a 3-story Victorian with its spine bent, shingles missing, and windows that looked like cataract eyes. The rain gathered in brown puddles along the path as I walked up. Before I even rang the bell, I felt it, a pressure, not on my chest, not exactly in my head, more like the air had thickened just enough to make every step a little heavier. The lawyer was waiting inside, nervous, tapping a pen against a folder. He did the usual routine. Everything must go. Take what you want, make an offer, sign here. While we talked, something creaked deep in the house. A long, low, dragging sound that did not match any storm noise I knew. The lawyer paused, then forced a smile and said, "Old houses make old sounds. I have lived my life in old houses. They do not sound like that." I went room by room, cataloguing with my eyes. A few decent clocks, some silverware, framed paintings, a grandfather clock that probably had more sentimental than market value. It was disappointing, to be honest. Old name, old house, but nothing that would make my regulars fight each other with their wallets. I was halfway done when I noticed a door I had not seen before. It was at the end of the hallway on the second floor, narrow and painted the same shade of off-white as the walls. There was no trim around it, no knob, just a small iron latch. It felt wrong, as if someone had drawn a door and then tried to erase it. I pushed the latch up. The door swung inward on stiff hinges, exhaling a breath of air that smelled like old incense and damp wood. The room was small, barely more than a closet. The only piece of furniture inside was the cabinet. It stood against the far wall, dark wood gone nearly black with age, its surface carved with vines and leaves that twisted into shapes my eyes did not want to follow. At the center of the door was a circular piece of glass the size of my palm, slightly convex and stained faintly yellow. It was not quite a mirror. It reflected light, but not detail, like a blind eye catching a glimmer it could not understand. I stepped closer and felt that pressure again, the thickening air, the subtle dip in temperature. My fingertips brushed the carvings. The wood felt warm, as if someone had just been holding it. I told myself it was because the room was small, less space for warmth to escape. Then I realized the door to the room was still open behind me, and the rest of the house felt much colder. I should have walked away. Instead, I did what years of habit trained me to do. I knelt, looked under the cabinet for rot or damage, checked the feet, the joints, the back, solid, no wobbling. I opened the door. The inside was lined with a fabric so dark it drank the light from my phone flashlight. No shelves, no hooks, just one empty space, yet it felt full. My eyes told me it was empty, but something in my body insisted there was something inside, pressed back against that darkness, watching me lean in. I closed it gently, my heart beating faster than the situation warranted. It was just a cabinet, just old wood and someone's idea of art. I told myself that while my signature went on the purchase agreement and my cash traded hands. The lawyer looked relieved when I mentioned the small room and the cabinet. He said I was welcome to it and then changed the subject quickly, like a man afraid to say a name aloud. That night, I brought the cabinet to my shop alone. I own a narrow storefront on a quiet street, the kind of place people say has character when they mean outdated. I wheeled the cabinet in on a dolly, careful not to gouge the old wooden floor. The bell above the door chimed once, loudly, then fell silent, even though the door swung for several seconds. I locked up, turned the sign to closed, and rolled the cabinet to the center of the floor. It looked different under my lights. Taller somehow, heavier, as if it had grown roots into the boards. The carved vines seemed to shift when I moved, their shadows sliding over each other in ways that did not match my steps. The yellowed glass eye caught the fluorescence and threw them back in a dull, sickly glow. I told myself I was tired. That was true. The rain, the drive, the dead man's house. It all sat on me. I decided to leave the cabinet in the middle of the shop for the night so I could examine it properly in the morning. I shut off the lights, leaving only the small lamp by the register on, the one I always leave for comfort more than security. Old man habits, old man fears. As I walked to the back door to go up to my apartment above the shop, I heard the softest click from behind me. It was the sound of a latch closing. I turned. The cabinet door was shut. That would have been unremarkable, except for the fact that I had never opened it after bringing it in. I remembered that clearly. My hands had been on the dolly, on the sides, but not the door. The memory stood solid in my mind like a photograph. For a moment I considered unlocking the front door and rolling the cabinet back out into the street. Instead, I told myself what any rational adult tells themselves when confronted with something that does not add up. I must have forgotten. I must have imagined I had not touched it. Old age, long day, all the excuses lined up. I went upstairs, made myself a sandwich, and tried to drown that small, cold knot in my stomach with warm food and an old movie. I woke up at 3:17 a.m. to the bell on the shop door. It was a sharp, clear chime directly under my bed, which sits in the apartment above the front half of the store. There is no sound in this world quite like the sound of a locked door bell ringing in the dead of night. It is pure intrusion. My heart slammed against my ribs so hard I could hear it in my ears. I sat up, holding my breath. For a second, I tried to convince myself it was a dream. Before I could finish the thought, the bell rang again. Just once, I grabbed the heavy brass flashlight I keep by the bed and the shop keys. My knees protested on the narrow stairs as I went down, each creak of the steps sounding louder than it should. The small lamp by the register was still on, casting long shadows across the shelves. The front door was locked. The deadbolt was in place. The chain was on. The bell above the door hung motionless. The only thing that had changed was the cabinet. It no longer stood in the center of the floor. Now it was 3 feet closer to the door. I stared for a full minute, my mind running through impossible explanations. Foundations shift, floors tilt, heavy furniture slides on its own. Except I had lived above that shop for 11 years, and nothing had ever moved itself 3 feet in complete silence. I walked around the cabinet, examining the floor. No scratch marks, no scuffed boards, no sign of dragging. I pressed my shoulder to it. It refused to budge. It felt heavier than it had that afternoon, as if someone had filled it with stone. That was when I remembered the latch sound from earlier. I stood facing the door to the cabinet, flashlight in one hand, shop key still in the other. I do not know how long I stood there like that, a foolish old man staring at a piece of furniture as if waiting for it to speak. Eventually, pride bullied fear into retreat. I set the key down, took a breath, and opened the door. Empty. The same black fabric, the same depth that felt deeper than it looked. My flashlight beam seemed to hit the back panel and then vanish as if swallowed. I reached in and tapped the back with my knuckles. Solid wood. no hollow echo. Still, my hand came back colder than it had gone in. I closed the door and latched it. The moment the metal clicked into place, something knocked back from inside. 3 quick taps. I dropped the flashlight. The beam spun across the floor and hit the glass eye on the cabinet. For the first time, it reflected my face clearly, except my eyes were closed in that reflection, and my mouth was slightly open, like a man in deep sleep. I stepped back so fast, I hit one of the display cases. Glass rattled. The sound snapped me out of whatever trance I was falling into. I snatched up the flashlight, refused to look at the glass eye again, and backed away until my shoulders hit the front door. I stayed there, watching the cabinet, waiting for another knock. None came. I did not sleep the rest of that night. In the morning, sunlight helped me lie to myself again. Things looked different in daylight, less sharp, less threatening. I moved the cabinet to a corner against the wall, directly across from the register, telling myself I was just arranging the floor. The truth is, I wanted to keep it where I could see it without turning my back. I put a small, not for sale tag on it. I had not decided if I wanted to sell it, keep it, or burn it. The first customer to notice it came in just after lunch. A middle-aged woman, regular buyer of oddities. She stopped in front of the cabinet like she had walked into a wall. "What is this?" she said, not a question so much as a demand. "Just came in," I replied, forcing a neutral tone. "From an old estate." She did not reach out, did not touch the carvings like most people do. Her eyes went straight to the glass eye on the door. I watched the color drain from her face. "It is looking at me," she whispered. "It is just glass," I said. "No," she replied, backing away. "It is disappointed." She left without buying anything. She did not come back in the weeks that followed. That was the first sign the cabinet did not belong among the living. The second came 3 days later when a smell began to seep from the wood. At first it was faint, like old incense again, mixed with something metallic. I tried to ignore it. Antique furniture carries smells, smoke, perfume, mold. You learn to accept that, but this one changed over time. By the end of the week, it smelled like wet iron and soil after a grave has been opened. I tried cleaning it. I wiped the surface with oil, polished the carvings, even sprinkled baking soda inside and closed the door for a day. When I opened it, the baking soda was gone, not spilled, not clumped, gone. The inside was as bare as before, except now the smell was worse. Then the dreams started. I have never been much of a dreamer. At least not the kind that remembers them. Suddenly my nights filled with a single repeating image. I stood in a long, narrow room lined with cabinets identical to mine. Each one had that single glass eye in the center. I walked past them, counting. 19, 20, 21. The eyes watched me, their glass shifting from yellow to a deep, fresh red. At the end of the room stood one cabinet with its door slightly open. From the sliver of darkness inside, a hand reached out, palm up, waiting. When I woke from the dream, my hand hurt. The first time, I wrote it off as age. Nerve pain, arthritis. The second time, there were faint bruises around my wrist. The third time, I woke standing at the foot of my bed, arms stretched out toward the door to the shop below. I started locking the door between the apartment and the shop at night. It did not help. At 2:43 a.m. one night, I woke standing in front of the cabinet downstairs, key in the lock, bare feet cold on the floorboards. The door to my apartment was still locked behind me, the chain on the shop door still in place. The only thing out of order was me and the way the cabinet ES glass eye now reflected my whole body, not just my face, standing slightly closer than I actually was. I began to research the house where I had found it. Obituaries, forgotten articles, town records. It turned out the family had been prosperous once, then reclusive, then tragic. The last 3 generations had lost spouses and children in increasingly strange accidents. Fires that did not spread beyond a single room. Drownings in tubs with barely an inch of water. One man found seated upright at a table, hands folded, heart simply stopped, no medical explanation. One by one they died inside that house until only the last relative remained. He died alone in his chair, facing the hallway, as if waiting for someone who never came. There was no mention of the cabinet. I called the lawyer casually at first. Just checking in, I said. Wanted to ask if there had been any local interest in the house before me. Any trouble? He went quiet. Then he asked which room I had taken furniture from. When I mentioned the small hidden room at the end of the hall, the line crackled. That door was supposed to stay closed, he said finally. I waited. The client left a letter, he added, instructions. I was not to enter that room, no one was. The door was painted over. We thought it was just an old storage closet. I did not realize you had taken anything from there. What did the letter say? I asked. He hesitated. Only this, do not take its container. It will want to leave, it cannot leave. When I hung up, my shop felt smaller. The air felt thick again. I turned slowly, not wanting to, but compelled. The cabinet stood where I had left it, but the "not for sale" tag was gone. In its place, hanging from the handle, was a small paper label in my own handwriting that read, "Reserved." I had never written it. That night I made a decision I should have made earlier. I would get rid of it, not sell it, not pass it along to some other poor soul. Destroy it. I waited until after closing. I unplugged everything that could catch fire. I moved the cabinet to the center of the bare floor. The wood seemed to resist my grip, my arms trembling more from something other than exertion. I took my old carpenter hammer from the toolbox and stood in front of the cabinet door. "You are wood," I said aloud, because hearing my own voice helped. Just wood. I swung the hammer at the glass eye. The metal head stopped an inch away, as if it had struck something invisible. The jolt ran back up my arm and into my spine. The hammer flew out of my hand, clattering across the floor. The cabinet did not so much as shake. The glass eye gleamed, and for a split second I saw not my reflection, but the narrow room from my dreams behind it. Cabins lined up, red eyes glowing, the open door at the far end. Then the image was gone, and it was just my frightened old face staring back at me, sweat shining on my forehead. I tried to tip the cabinet, to push it over. It would not move. It was as if the floor had grown around its feet. Panting, humiliated by a piece of furniture, I backed away. My heart pounded too fast, my chest tightening. I braced my hand on the counter, riding out the wave of dizziness. When it passed, the shop was darker. The lamp by the register had gone out. I turned toward the light switch. It was only a few steps away, but I did not make it. The cabinet door opened. It moved slowly, without creak or complaint, swinging outward just enough to reveal the dark interior. The smell rolled out first, thick and damp, like soil piled over too many years of decay. The temperature dropped. I could see my breath in faint puffs in front of my face. From inside the cabinet came a sound, not a voice, not exactly words, a layered whisper, a dozen tongues speaking at once in different cadences, all overlapping. It sounded like people talking in another room with the door mostly closed. Then cutting through that storm of whispers came something clear. "Come back," it said in my own voice. The hairs on the back of my neck rose so sharply it hurt. I staggered backward, ready to run for the front door and drag this cursed thing onto the street. My heel caught on the dropped hammer. I went down hard, hips slamming into the wooden floor. Pain shot up my side, blurring my vision for a moment. When I blinked it clear, the cabinet door was wide open. The interior was no longer empty. On the back panel hung 19 small paper tags, each with a name written in neat, old-fashioned handwriting. I could not read all of them from where I lay, but they looked like family names. Some had dates, some did not. The whispering grew louder, threads of words slipping out. Help, stay, mine, open, back. In the center of that back panel, just below the tags, was a hook, an empty hook. I felt the weight of something in my front pocket. My hand moved before my brain caught up, pulling out the small paper tag I use sometimes for pricing. It was blank. My fingers trembled toward a pen that lay near the register. That was when I realized the whispering was no longer coming from the cabinet alone. It was in my head, pressed against the inside of my skull, urging, coaxing, pleading with a tone that sounded disturbingly like relief. All it wanted was a name. My name. I do not know how long I sat there on the floor, clutching the blank tag, fighting the urge to write. It felt less like resisting temptation and more like pushing back against a tide. The room narrowed until the only things that existed were the hook, the tag, the pen, and the cabinet's open mouth. In the end, what saved me was not strength. It was anger. Anger at the lawyer for not warning me. Anger at the dead family for leaving their poison behind. Anger at myself for bringing it into my shop, my home, my life. That anger burned hotter than the cabinet's cold grip. With a shout that sounded more like a wounded animal than a man, I tore the tag in half, then in half again, scattering the pieces across the floor. The whispering stopped. Silence slammed down so fast my ears rang. The cold lifted a fraction. The smell thinned. The cabinet door swung shut with a soft, almost polite click. The glass eye clouded back to its original murky yellow. I did not approach it again that night. I slept in my car, parked across the street, watching the front window of my shop until dawn painted the glass. The cabinet never moved that I could see. Yet I woke with the distinct sensation that something had stood at the shop window all night looking out at me, its face pressed just beyond the reach of the streetlights. You might be wondering what I did with it after that, whether I burned the whole building down, called a priest, a medium, a psychic. I did none of those things. I did what antique dealers have always done with dangerous things. I contained it. The cabinet now stands in a locked storage unit 3 towns away, bolted to the concrete floor, chains wrapped around it 6 times and fastened with industrial locks. I visit once a month to be sure it is still there. Every time I open the unit, I feel that same pressure in the air, the same thickening. The glass eye follows me as I walk, even though it does not move. The paper tags are still hanging inside. I learned that the last time I opened the door. There is a new one now. It reads, "The last owner, no date, no name." The hook beneath it is still empty. You might think chains and locks are enough, that if it is contained, it cannot hurt anyone. I thought that too until 3 days ago. A young man came into my shop, mid-20s, hoodie, phone in his hand. He wandered around without much interest until he reached the empty corner where the cabinet used to stand. He looked at that bare patch of floor and frowned. "Hey," he said, "do you still have the creepy old cabinet with the weird glass in the middle? I saw it on your website months ago. You said it was not for sale then. I have been thinking about it ever since." I have never posted a photograph of that cabinet online. I stared at him, my mouth too dry to speak. He continued casually, "I had this dream, you know. There was a room full of cabinets, all lined up, and one of them was open, like it was waiting. When I woke up, I just knew I had to come back and see if you still had it." When he smiled, for a split second, his teeth reflected in something over my shoulder. A curved glint, like light on convex glass. I keep telling myself that I contained the cabinet, that it is just sitting in that storage unit, chained and silent. But each night when I close the shop, the bell above the door sways once, chimes once, even when no one enters or leaves. Something got out, or something reached in. So if an antique dealer ever offers you a beautiful old cabinet with a single round piece of glass in the center of its door, walk away. If you dream of a narrow room lined with them, do not go toward the one that is open. And if you ever find yourself standing in front of such a cabinet, feeling the urge to write your name on anything at all, remember this old man's voice and my trembling hands. Objects can outlive regret. Containers can learn to open themselves. And some cabinets are not meant for clothes or dishes or keepsakes. They are meant for us.